Sometimes, a quiet street can hide the deepest secrets. Sometimes, a simple phone call can tear lives apart. This is the story of what happened on Harding Street in Houston, Texas, on January 28, 2019. It is the story of two homeowners who did not expect danger that day, a group of police officers who believed they were entering a house filled with drugs and guns, and a neighbor's story that set everything in motion. Although these events are tragic, they teach us about the power of rumors, the risks of rushing into action, and the lasting effects of broken trust. This story begins with a married couple, Dennis Wayne Tuttle and Rogina and Nicholas. Dennis was 59 years old and Rogina was 58. People described them as ordinary folks who faced many problems but still went on with life. Dennis had once served in the U.S. Navy. He grew up near Houston and joined the Navy because he loved the water. Sadly, he had an accident during his service and developed seizures. He was honorably discharged and later suffered other injuries, including a serious car crash. All these health problems led him to stop working. Rogina, born in Mississippi, moved to Houston in the 1980s. She had family in the area, cared for Dennis, and sometimes helped an ex-partner who lived nearby. They were not wealthy. They struggled with health issues and other daily concerns. Still, they owned a small house on Harding Street in the Pecan Park area of Houston's East End. Life on Harding Street was usually calm. Neighbors might notice people mowing lawns or walking dogs. But like in many places, conflicts sometimes bubbled under the surface. One of those neighbors was Patricia and Garcia. She had disagreements with Dennis and Rogina. Maybe they argued about noise, property boundaries, or something else. On January 8, 2019, Patricia called the police. She told them a wild story. She claimed her daughter, supposedly 25 years old, was inside Dennis and Rogina's home, doing heroin. She also said the couple had machine guns and were very dangerous. These words were alarming. A mother telling the police that her daughter was in trouble, surrounded by drugs and weapons, seemed like an emergency. But Patricia was not telling the truth. She did not even have a daughter that age. What she said was completely made up. Her phone call set off a chain of events. The Houston Police Department, HPD, took this tip very seriously. Drugs and machine guns in a neighborhood? That sounded like a threat to public safety. One officer, Gerald Goins, began to work on this case. Goins had worked in HPD since around 1985. He had been shot twice before in separate incidents. Many people saw him as a tough narcotics officer who was determined to remove drugs from the streets. Yet, as the events on Harding Street would show, not every detail in Goins's police work was as it seemed. A few days passed after Patricia's phone call. 3 weeks later, Goins swore in a document, called an affidavit, that a confidential informant had bought black tar heroin inside Dennis and Rogina's house. An affidavit is what police use to convince a judge that there is a good reason to enter a property. Goins wanted a no-knock warrant. A no-knock warrant allows the police to break down the door without warning, especially if they fear the suspects might destroy evidence or shoot at officers. Some people argue this method is safer for the police. Others believe it is extremely risky because the sudden shock can cause confusion and shooting on both sides. In any case, Goins told the judge that he had proof of drug dealing at the house. The judge signed the warrant, trusting that Goins's statement was true. But Goins's story turned out to be a lie. Later, the informant Goins named said he had never bought drugs from that house. Other informants also denied helping Goins. This false claim about black tar heroin would soon lead police officers into a deadly raid. On January 28, 2019, the police arrived at Dennis and Rogina's home to serve this no-knock warrant. It was evening, and the team believed they were about to face dangerous criminals. They had been told the couple had machine guns. They believed heroin was on the property. Their hearts pounded with worry. Fear can make people more willing to use force, especially if they think their lives might be at risk. Once they reached the house, they broke down the door. According to some sources, the first thing they did was shoot the couple's dog, which they saw as a threat. Then, shots rang out in the confusion. Dennis and Regina had not been expecting any of this. They heard yelling, footsteps, and gunfire. The official police report says Dennis fired a gun at the officers, hitting 4 of them, though later evidence suggested at least some officers might have been hit by friendly fire, bullets from their own team. Police claimed Regina tried to grab a wounded officer's shotgun, yet many people doubted that. The scene turned chaotic in seconds. When the shooting ended, Dennis and Regina were both on the ground with fatal wounds. 4 officers had gunshot injuries, and a 5th officer had a serious knee injury. 1 officer ended up paralyzed. What started with a neighbor's false tip ended with blood on the floor, a wrecked home, and people either dead or badly hurt. At first, the police department stood by the officers' actions. They believed they had walked into a dangerous place and fought back against armed suspects. But the truth began to leak out. No heroin was found in the house. There were no machine guns. Only a small amount of marijuana and a tiny bit of cocaine were discovered, small enough for personal use. This was not the large stash of illegal drugs or weapons Goins had reported. People in the neighborhood wondered why such force was used. The media started digging for answers. Then, more details came to light. The neighbor's original story about a daughter on heroin was false. The supposed informant who bought black tar heroin also said he never stepped foot in that house. It looked like the entire reason for the raid was based on untrue statements. As investigations went on, officials examined the couple's autopsies. Dennis Tuttle had up to 9 bullet wounds across his body. His head, neck, chest, shoulder, arms, legs, and more. He had THC, the main chemical in marijuana, in his system. Regina Nicholas had 2 bullet wounds and some fragments from gunfire. Her toxicology report showed a byproduct linked to cocaine, but no actual cocaine in her blood. These findings did not match the image of large-scale drug traffickers. Meanwhile, the wounded officers were treated at a hospital. Some went through major surgeries. 1 officer retired with life-changing injuries. The city of Houston demanded an explanation. Many were angry that 2 people were shot dead in their own home based on a false story. They asked how the police could rely on claims that were never confirmed. They pointed fingers at Gerald Goins, who filed the paperwork for the raid. Some blamed Patricia Garcia, the neighbor whose made-up phone calls started the panic. Others questioned whether the Houston Police Department had proper safeguards to check an officer's claims before granting a no-knock warrant. Over time, HPD Chief Art Acevedo admitted something had gone very wrong. Gerald Goins was charged with 2 counts of felony murder because people believed he lied to get the no-knock warrant, causing 2 deaths. Another officer, Stephen Bryant, was charged with tampering with evidence, which means he might have tried to hide or change facts about the raid. More officers were later charged for different reasons, such as providing false reports. At least 11 current or former HPD officers would eventually be indicted. That is a very high number of officers facing charges from the same case, showing how deep the problems ran. Meanwhile, Patricia Garcia was also punished for making those untrue 911 calls. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to federal prison. But for the families of Dennis Tuttle and Regina Nicholas, this was not enough to fix their grief. They said the 2 homeowners were victims of a horrible mistake, or worse, a terrible misuse of police power. They hired their own team of forensic experts to examine the house months after the raid. These experts found bullet holes that seemed to come from outside the house. They saw evidence that suggested some of the officers' gunshot wounds might have been from their own colleagues. They were surprised to find that the official investigation had left important pieces of evidence behind, which made them believe that the city was not very careful when looking at what truly happened that day. As more evidence surfaced, public trust in the Houston Police Department began to collapse. Local newspapers wrote strong editorials, saying HPD had lost the faith of the people. Some pointed out that no-knock warrants can be dangerous unless officers are certain about the facts. Others said this case showed why no-knock warrants should be banned because of the risk to both citizens and police. In the Texas legislature, lawmakers Gene Wu and Boris Miles proposed a bill to end no-knock warrants entirely. They said this case was proof that a surprise entry could quickly turn deadly. Civil lawsuits followed. Relatives of Dennis and Regina sued the city, claiming that their loved ones' rights were violated. The city council later voted to use city funds to defend itself and the former chief, which upset some taxpayers. They believed so much money should not be spent on legal defenses for a raid that never should have happened. But legal battles can be long and expensive. The lawsuits continued for years, with more depositions and evidence coming to light. During that time, a major search began inside the Houston Police Department. Officials looked at thousands of past cases tied to Goins and other officers in his squad. These were old drug arrests, convictions, and investigations. If Goins lied in one case, how many others might also be flawed? By the end of 2021, more than 160 cases had been thrown out. Some people who had been found guilty years before were released because the evidence in their cases no longer seemed reliable. In one example, George Floyd, who later became internationally known after his death in Minneapolis in 2020, had been arrested on a drug charge in 2004 in a case involving Goins. That conviction also came under review. Although there was a recommendation to pardon Floyd, the Texas governor's office withdrew the plan for unclear reasons. Even so, this showed how the Harding Street raid investigation reached back to the early 2000s and affected many old cases. In the end, the biggest criminal trial involved Gerald Goins. He faced both state and federal charges. People watched closely to see if he would be found guilty. In September 2024, a jury convicted him of murder. During the sentencing, Goins had a medical emergency and had to leave the courtroom, which caused a brief delay. When the proceedings continued, he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. This was a rare event. A police officer who led a deadly raid was now serving time for murder. For many in Houston, it was a sign that the justice system was trying to correct a serious wrong. But no sentence could bring back Dennis and Regina or heal the wounds of the officers who were shot. After this painful chapter, HPD introduced a new rule. A no-knock warrant must be approved by the department head or a top leader before it can be used. The idea is to force careful review and possibly prevent future tragedies. Some wonder if that is enough. Others call for an all-out ban on no-knock warrants. People continue to debate how police can do their jobs effectively without putting innocent citizens at risk. Nobody wants drug dealers to go free, but nobody wants another tragedy like what happened on Harding Street. Groups such as We the People Organize painted a mural to honor Dennis and Regina, reminding everyone that two people lost their lives because of a false tip and a rushed police raid. The mural stands as a symbol of the harm that can happen when facts are twisted by rumors or lies. It also shows that life can be fragile and that law enforcement must be handled with care and truth. Neighbors should speak honestly and try peaceful solutions instead of creating a chain of events that leads to someone's death. The Harding Street raid stands out in Houston's history as a dark moment. It happened quickly but left lasting marks on the city, the families of the victims, and the police department's reputation. It also changed policies, prompting more checks on police claims and more caution with how warrants are approved. Cases like this remind us that fear can be a powerful emotion. Fear of drugs, fear of dangerous suspects, or fear of missing a criminal can drive officers to act with great force. But if the information behind that fear is false, the results can be tragic. It is important to think about the simple mistakes that might have saved lives. If Patricia Garcia had told the truth instead of inventing stories about her daughter, Dennis and Regina might still be alive. If Officer Goins had not lied about the confidential informant's heroin buy, the police might have taken more time to investigate before entering the house. If the judge had asked for more evidence or proof, maybe the warrant would have been denied. If the police had knocked and announced themselves, maybe Dennis and Regina would have had a chance to show there was no threat. But these ifs cannot change what happened. Many people ask how things went wrong so quickly. One big problem was the trust placed in a single officer's word and a single neighbor's call. Another problem was the willingness to use a powerful tactic like a no-knock raid without enough proof. Also, once the raid began, the officers were on high alert, expecting violence. This can lead to quick trigger pulls and confusion about who fired first. The scene turned into a deadly storm of bullets within seconds. Because of this incident, a conversation began about how police can gain the trust of citizens again. Houston's police chief at the time promised a thorough investigation, but it took many months for charges to be filed. Some people felt the process moved too slowly, while others believed the district attorney's office needed time to build a strong case. When news about officers lying came out, some felt betrayed, wondering if other raids or arrests might also have been based on false reports. Community members gathered to protest in front of City Hall, asking for a ban on no-knock warrants. Others, like certain legislators, tried to pass new laws. Some officials argued that officers do need the element of surprise to catch truly dangerous criminals who might destroy evidence. But many believed Harding Street was proof that the risks are too high, especially if the basic facts are wrong. For the families of Dennis and Regina, the situation was heart-wrenching. They had to handle funerals, media interviews, legal actions, and the bitter realization that their loved ones died because of a completely avoidable mistake. They spoke about Dennis's injuries and Regina's caring nature. They described them as people who liked to live quietly, not as ruthless drug dealers. They also criticized the official records that painted them in a bad light, claiming it was unfair to blame them after death. In July 2020, new charges were filed against additional officers. By June 2021, around 11 current or former officers had been indicted in connection to the Harding Street case. This was a clear sign that something far bigger than a single mistake had happened. The department had to look back at thousands of old cases, worried that this might not be the only time false information was used to get a warrant. More than 160 cases were dropped by the end of 2021, and that number kept rising. For the legal system, this was a massive task. Many defendants who had been convicted of drug crimes were released, and some said they felt cheated by the justice system that had relied on dishonest tactics. One of these overturned cases drew attention because it involved George Floyd, who grew up in Houston's 3rd Ward. He had been convicted of a drug charge in 2004 where Goins played a role. Although a pardon was considered, it was not granted, yet the situation raised even more questions about Goins's earlier work. How many other people might have gone to prison based on untrue statements? The district attorney's office faced intense pressure to sort through mountains of evidence. Meanwhile, the lawsuits continued. The families of Dennis and Regina sued the city in January 2021, saying the raid violated the couple's basic rights. They argued the city should be held responsible for not preventing such an operation. In January 2024, former Chief Acevedo said he had been served with a subpoena to testify in that lawsuit, even though he was then working at a police job in Aurora, Colorado. Not long after, the Houston City Council approved more funding for law firms to defend against the case. The story of Harding Street had not ended. Its ripples were still spreading. Years later, some changes did happen. Houston began requiring high-level approval for no-knock warrants. This meant officers could not just claim they had enough reason. A top-ranking official had to agree. Critics said this was a small step and did not truly fix the problem. Others said it was a good way to prevent future disasters, forcing police to be sure their information is correct. The city also tried to be more open about how these raids are handled. In 2022, a local group revealed a mural in memory of Dennis and Regina. Bright colors decorated a city wall, showing their faces and calling for justice. Activists said they wanted people never to forget what happened on Harding Street. They believed this event showed that any of us could be at risk if the system allows lies and fear to overrule caution and truth. Parents brought their children to see the mural and to explain why honesty matters, both for the police and for ordinary citizens. From the first false phone call to the final charges in court, the Harding Street raid is a lesson in how quickly fear and misinformation can lead to tragedy. It warns us that a single neighbor's claim can turn a normal day into a nightmare, and a single officer's dishonesty can bring down an entire police unit. For Dennis Tuttle and Regina Nicholas, it ended in death. For the officers, it ended in prison sentences, injuries, and deep regret. For Houston, it brought anger, grief, and calls for reform. Still, the story is not only about blame. It is also about how we can learn and grow. Communities began asking for police accountability. People spoke out about the dangers of trusting one unverified tip. Lawmakers looked at better ways to handle warrants. Neighbors realized that small feuds could blow up if taken to extremes. Officers became more aware of how easily they could be misled, or how they could mislead others if they failed to check their facts. If there is any hope to come from such sadness, it is that future tragedies might be prevented if people remember the lessons from Harding Street. We also cannot forget the very real human cost. 2 lives were lost. 5 officers were injured, with 1 left paralyzed. Families were torn apart by grief and guilt. It is hard to face such sorrow, especially when it was avoidable. In interviews, relatives said Dennis and Regina had enough daily struggles with health and money. They did not deserve to die in their own living room because of made-up stories. Similarly, those officers did not deserve to be shot, thinking they were fighting criminals who did not truly exist. The entire event could have been avoided with better fact-checking and less trust in a neighbor's false words. In September 2024, when Gerald Goins was convicted of murder, that was a turning point. The law rarely holds police officers to account so severely. His 60-year sentence made national headlines, reminding everyone that nobody, not even a long-time officer, is above the law. Yet even this verdict could not reverse the harm done. The families of Tuttle and Nicholas watched the man who caused their loved ones' deaths go to prison, but it did not bring them back. The officer who lost his mobility would never walk again. The neighbors who heard gunshots that day would never forget the screams and the sight of flashing lights on their street. Today, people still discuss the Harding Street raid as a clear sign that no-knock warrants need strict rules. Many want laws that make it harder to get such warrants, or they want them banned altogether. Others point to times when no-knock warrants caught real criminals who truly were armed and dangerous. Yet almost everyone agrees that lying to get a warrant is wrong, and that lives were ruined because nobody double-checked the story about heroin sales or a non-existent daughter. It is a reminder that facts must be confirmed before taking such drastic steps. In the end, this is a story of 2 different sets of fears colliding. One was the fear of a neighbor who claimed there were drugs and guns, whether from anger, revenge, or misunderstanding. The other was the fear of the police, who believed they faced a life-threatening situation. When fear takes hold, facts can be ignored, and tragedy can follow. If anything remains after the lawsuits and headlines fade, it is the caution that false stories can have terrible power, and that truth matters more than we sometimes realize. That is the enduring lesson of Harding Street. No one planned for 2 people to die, or for officers to be shot. But it happened because small lies grew into big ones, and those lies were handed to police who did not ask enough questions. By the time anyone realized the truth, Dennis and Regina were gone, and their names were added to the long list of people who died in raids that did not turn out as planned. As Houston tries to heal and move forward, residents hope their city will never again witness such a painful event. May the memory of that day serve as a constant reminder to check the facts, to act carefully, and to put honesty before fear.